I am speaking to you at a moment of grave crisis, when violent and fanatical men are attempting to destroy the unity and the freedom of Canada. One aspect of that crisis is the threat which has been made on the lives of two innocent men.
The year of 1917 Quebec as a historian. What a chaotic and frightening year that was. 53 years later, the memory of that October still evokes a certain pain and a terrible anguish. It was an autumn of brilliant sunshine and relative prosperity. It should have been a time of hope and thanksgiving, but October 1970 became instead a time of turmoil unprecedented in the country. Terrorists named the FLQ, or the Front for the Liberation of Quebec, had seized every corner of legitimacy possible in Quebec. Soldiers were in the streets, and the body of a very important politician named Pierre Laporte was found in the trunk of a car, and a great many Canadians were simply scared. Kind of the thing that was supposed to happen in other countries. The other countries that were the stuff of the newspapers and television, but not in Canada, that had just celebrated its centennial. As the years go by, it is harder and harder to explain what happened in October 1970 to those who went around. Hard to explain why the country's values seemed imperiled, why the country itself seemed in danger of a collapse. But as a historian, here's a brief description of why the things that happened. Although for that to occur, we'll need to switch our focus to the March of 1963, when the FLQ was first founded by Raymond Valleau, Gabriel Hudon, Paul Rose, and Pierre Valeris. Early 60s, the culture of North America was evolving quickly towards a more action-oriented process of change. Quebec was no exception, with the ongoing reforms of the new liberal government and the development of the Quiet Revolution. The impact of the revolutionary philosophy and politics also began to spread the doctrines of violent action as a means of legitimate change among young people and university students. Figures such as Che Guevara, Chairman Mao, and the writer Frantz Fanon offered different interpretations of history and politics where violence played a key role in their philosophies. The frustration at the pace of change in Quebec led some to believe that only violence would fix this problem now, thus resulting in the creation of the FLQ. The FLQ was also stimulated by international factors such as the decolonization of Algeria and the success of the Khalistan Liberation Organization in reforming mere members of the FLQ. 23rd, 1963, when a few FLQ activists placed bombs in mailboxes in 3 federal armories of Quebec and in Westmount, a wealthy upper-middle-class Anglophone area of Montreal. Their objective was the complete destruction of the influence and symbols of English colonialism in Quebec. Sergeant Major Walter Leger of the Canadian Armed Forces was seriously injured when he tried to neutralize one of the bombs. After that incident, the violent attacks and murders committed by the FLQ kept gradually rising. I particularly remember this incident on March 28, 1964, when 5 armed members of the FLQ stole approximately $50,000 in cash along with military equipment from the warehouse of the manufacturer company International Firearms. Also during the robbery, a member of the FLQ killed the company's vice president, and another employee was killed by the police, who happened to mistake him for one of the thieves. From 1963 to 1967, the FLQ was involved in over 200 bombings. But also during this period, many attempts were made by the government to satisfy the needs of Quebec, or mainly the Francophone community of Quebec. For an example, the Equalization Treaty was introduced where oil money from Alberta would be distributed to Quebec for the welfare of the Francophone community. However, that didn't work, and in 1968, the FLQ began using larger/more powerful bombs, setting them off at a federal government bookstore on McGill University, at the residence of Mayor Jean Drapeau, at the Provincial Department of Labor, and on February 16, 1969, at the Montreal Stock Exchange, where 27 people were killed. Mind you, the FLQ always had the support of the Francophone community to back the terrorist activities. The FLQ was such a very horrid militant group. On October 5, 1970, a gang of 4 armed men drove along Montreal's Red Path Crescent and up to the imposing house that was the home of British Trade Commissioner James Red Cross. Within moments, they had invaded the house and emerged with Mr. Cross in handcuffs, as they bundled him into a car bearing the dome of a Lazel taxi, and they drove off. Within hours, they had issued a swaggering communique that described Mr. Cross as the representative of the ancient racist and colonialist British system, and set out a breathtaking list of demands. They wanted the release of 23 political prisoners who would be flown to Cuba or Algeria, 500,000 in gold bars, the publication of the FLQ manifesto in newspapers and on radio and television across Quebec.
The FLQ manifesto. The Front de Libération du Québec is not the Messiah, nor a modern-day Robin Hood. It is a regrouping of Quebec workers who have decided to use every means at their disposal to ensure that the people of Quebec assume control of their own destiny.
The identification of a police informer within the FLQ and the government for 24 hours to comply with their demands, but the government rejected the ultimatum while declaring that it was ready to negotiate. The uneasiness caused by the kidnapping of Mr. Cross became a serious alarm after 5 days, when Quebec's Labour, Manpower/Immigration Minister, Mr. Pierre Laporte, was kidnapped while playing football with his nephew in a park. I mean, one, kidnapping was bad luck, and two, was an indication that Canada was in dire straits. Swift response from the federal government and the Liberal leader Pierre Trudeau. On 15th October, the Quebec government formally requested assistance from the Canadian Armed Forces to supplement the local police. And on 16th October 1970, the federal government declared the War Measures Act for the first time during peacetime in Canadian history. CBC reporter Tim Ralph questioned the Prime Minister concerning the armed soldiers on Parliament Hill. Trudeau responded now famous dialogue.
In the kind of society that you live
well,
in.
there's a lot of bleeding hearts around who just don't like to see people with helmets and guns. All I can say is go on and bleed, but it's more important to keep law and order in this society than to be worried about weak-kneed people who don't like the looks of a soldier.
At any cost? At any cost? How far would you go with that? How far would you extend that?
Well, just watch me.
Well, back on the topic, the following day and 1 week after Pierre Laporte was taken hostage, his body was found in the trunk of a car near Saint Hubert Airport. Under the War Measures Act, the RCMP detained 468 people who were believed to have been association with FLQ. Although 438 people were later released within 8 days without laying of hearing of any charges, it was later proven that those 438 people were just arrested for expressing their support for Quebec's sovereignty rather than actually engaging in terrorist activities, thus proving that the arrests committed by the RCMP were unlawful, as the Constitution states that everyone has a right to be secure against unreasonable search or seizure, while it also states that everyone has a right not to be detained or imprisoned without a reason. It also states that everyone has to be informed about the reasons for their arrest. These particular people arrested by the RCMP were also not provided with a lawyer. I mean, that's illegal under the Constitution. Regardless, the War Measures Act gave such stupendous power to the police that they could absolutely do anything they wanted without being questioned about it. Also, during this period, many restrictions were placed upon the general public living in Quebec. For an example, it was illegal to publicly discuss about the FLQ, leaving alone attending any of their rallies. It was also illegal for the media to present any anti-government material, as there were rules in place that all types of media had to showcase their support for the activities performed by the government. It was also illegal during this period to travel/in out of Quebec without a valid reason. It was also completely legal during this period for the RCMP to search anybody's personal property without a valid reason, while it was only completely legal for them to search anyone without a valid protection. My opinion. Well, I believe that the acts done by the government were just towards fighting terrorism, but were very unjust/discriminatory towards the innocent citizens of Quebec, especially towards those who were just expressing their support for the group rather than actually engaging in terrorist-related activities. I mean, after the war measures was in, the government ordered the arrest of 468 people, out of which 438 were later released without the laying of hearing any charges. Although the government later apologized to these people, it didn't do enough to reintegrate them back into society. I mean, despite the fact that they were released as innocent, it doesn't completely dissipate the fact that their life returned to normal after these set of incidents. My implication is that which employer would provide a job to a person who has just been acquitted from jail? Thus proving that by doing such menial activities under the sanctuary of the War Measures Act, the RCMP has not only done something unconstitutional, but they are also encouraging terrorism through hatred. Although the Canadian government brought an end to the reign of the Front for the Liberation of Quebec in the year of 1971, they weren't so successful in doing away with the idea of a sovereign nation, as the Parti Québécois was created on October 11, 1972. Parti Québécois, I'm referring to the party that has already held two separatist referendums, one in 1980 and the other in 1995. In the 1995 referendum, Quebec was only 1.16% of a vote away from being divided into a sovereign nation. This popular support for the Parti Québécois also resulted in the passage of Bill 101, or the bill that aimed to end all possible of the Canadian government has been with dealing the thought of a sovereign nation, thus meaning that the violence cannot always be repealed with violence, and that the Canadian federal government should think of a brand new method to appease the rights of the Anglophone community in Quebec while promoting the welfare of the Francophone community throughout Canada. Regardless, there were also some positives to take from this crisis. For an example, it is believed that the October crisis / its hooliganism motivated Mr. Pierre Trudeau, the then Prime Minister, to create the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, or document that would bind the individual rights of each and every Canadian, while it is also believed that this crisis inspired the members of the House of Commons to abolish the War Measures Act and replace it with the Emergency Powers Act. And don't forget to subscribe or watch some of my other videos.